The interior of Maigu Ridge had collapsed into a complete mess. Before, there had been hundreds upon thousands of caves, sprawling and interconnected, but now half of them had crumbled with the tremors, the fallen rocks forming barricades everywhere. Shen Qingqiu wove through the remains, struggling to navigate the ruins. Suddenly, from within a giant pile of rubble, there came a feeble wisp of demonic energy. Shen Qingqiu called without thinking, "Luo Binghe." It couldn't be that Luo Binghe was trapped here, having been sealed by Yue Qingyuan's binding technique, could it? He leapt over to the pile and lifted the topmost stone slab. Underneath was a stretch of battered green scales. Small loose pebbles tumbled off them as they rose and fell weakly. Zhu Zilang's snake form was coiled into a small fortress, and Tianlangjun lay in the middle, sheltered within the watertight hold. The latter's body had deteriorated even further, to the point it seemed his head would fall off at any moment. He opened his eyes and looked at Shen Qingqiu, then even had the cheer to greet him. "Peak Lord Shen." "How's the situation with you two?" said Shen Qingqiu. "I've long since used to this, but Zhu Zilang isn't doing too well." Not doing too well indeed. Those two huge yellow eyes, once always as bright as lanterns, had begun to glaze over, though there was still life in them. Quite a few of his snake scales had been scraped off, leaving stretches of red and black wounds that patterned his entire body. Shen Qingqiu helped remove the stones crushing the snake's tail, then realized that Zhen Yang's sword was still stabbed into Zhu Zilang's body. He reached to grab the hilt, then yanked the sword out. Blood loss meant very little to demons. Rather, having Zhen Yang's sword and its powerful spiritual energy stabbed into him would have done far more harm. "Hasn't Peak Lord Shen always preferred to ignore him?" asked Tianlangjun. "Who said I've always ignored him?" said Shen Qingqiu. "It's just that sometimes communicating with him is difficult. How is he?" Tianlangjun, quote, stroked the snake's triangular head with the stump of his arm and didn't answer. Instead, he asked, "What will Peak Lord Shen do about the situation after this?" "Destroy the sword, of course." "Xingmo's invasion has already reached Luo Binghe's soul, binding their lives together. If you destroy the sword now, won't that be the same as killing him?" "Then I'll think up of another method," Shen Qingqiu said resolutely. "Even if you're unable to stop the merge in time?" Shen Qingqiu drew in a breath. "If I can't make it, then that's that," he said irritably. "We should do everything we can first, then worry about the rest later." At that, another smile finally appeared on Tianlangjun's face. He sighed and lamented. "As expected, I can't bring myself to hate humans." Shen Qingqiu didn't know how to respond to this line of his. It was joyful, yet seemed too heavy. "What about Luo Binghe?" he asked to change the topic. "Have you seen him?" "I thought Peak Lord Shen knew," Tianlangjun said, bemused. "Hasn't he been behind you this whole time?" Shen Qingqiu's hair stood on end, and he slowly turned his head. Sure enough, Luo Binghe stood behind him, eyes fixed unswervingly on his back. Exactly when had he begun standing there? Or perhaps the question was, exactly when had he begun following Shen Qingqiu? Luo Binghe smiled. "Shizun, Give me the sword. Shen Qingqiu maintained his composure and raised Xingmo's sword. You can come take it yourself. Luo Binghe took a step toward him, then suddenly stopped. The corner of his mouth twitched and his shoulders began to shake. Shen Qingqiu held the sword horizontally in front of him. What's wrong? Luo Binghe gritted his teeth. Get lost. Shen Qingqiu hadn't managed to respond when Luo Binghe pressed a hand to his temple, then lashed out with a spiritual blast. Get lost, all of you! Don't touch him! Get lost! Those words weren't meant for Shen Qingqiu, and the spiritual blast didn't strike him either. Instead, it grazed his shoulder, blasting apart the already pitted cave wall behind him. Tianlangjun offered a friendly reminder. Xingmo's sword conjures illusions. Even without him saying so, Shen Qingqiu had about guessed as much. At present, Luo Binghe clearly saw things no one else could. From his hand came haphazard blasts of spiritual energy and demonic qi, and he specifically attacked the space around Shen Qingqiu, engaged in brutal combat with a non-existent enemy. The mountain began to shake again, clusters of rocks rolling down. Shen Qingqiu looked at the two people by him, who could be fairly described as, quote, the sick and the elderly, unquote. Binghe, he yelled, come here. Though Luo Binghe looked somewhat dazed, he was still very obedient. Sure enough, he began to follow Shen Qingqiu. The one in front dashed with the wind beneath his heels, while the one in back seemed to drift like a wraith, though he somehow didn't fall behind in the slightest. In the middle of the chase, the system sent a notification. Luo Binghe, base anger points, 300, multiplied by Xingmo's coefficient of 10. The current value is 3,000. Where's the key item? Shen Qingqiu roared. Hurry the fuck up! The jade Guānjiàn, the jade pendant, give it here, quickly! Greetings. The key item is currently loading in. We recommend deploying another tool in the interim. Loading? What other tools are there? Show me. Gentle reminder. The small scenario pusher, luxury edition that you recently upgraded has yet to be used. Shen Qingqiu abruptly braked. In all honesty, to this day, he still hadn't figured out exactly what kind of doodad this, quote, small scenario pusher was, let alone how it worked. But based on his single experience with it before, he really did seem to be quite effective. Shen Qingqiu gritted his teeth. Give it here! He shouted, and then in his mind he thought, oh my god, let this great one see just how epic and thrilling this luxury edition is. Bring it on! He just forcefully slammed the, quote, confirm button when the ground beneath his feet collapsed again. As he fell, Shen Qingqiu had only one thought. Fuck me! You call that a small scenario pusher? It's a large scenario bulldozer! However, even after a long downward tumble, while rocky shadows rolled toward him from overhead, none of the rocks from the landslide smashed into him. Someone was shielding him from above. Luo Binghe was completely out of his mind, his senses muddled, but even at a time like this, he used his own body to block the rocks for Shen Qingqiu. With a backhanded shove, he flung the boulders that had struck his back aside like they weighed nothing. He stared blankly down into Shen Qingqiu's eyes, and, for a brief second, clarity seemed to flash through his pupils. But after a dazed blink, the murk returned. The dark red mark of sin crept over his forehead, expanding outward until marks covered the entirety of his snow-pale face, then continued spreading down his neck. Xingmo's sword had fallen beside them, and it seemed to respond to the marks on Luo Binghe's body. It glowed and dimmed, its purple light and black miasma circulating endlessly. 师尊, Luo Binghe mumbled. Said Shen Qingqiu. Blood trickled down Luo Binghe's forehead, and his voice seemed to quiver slightly. 师尊, is it really you? It's real this time? Asked Luo Binghe. Didn't you leave with the others just now? I saw you go. I won't leave, said Shen Qingqiu. Luo Binghe slowly lowered his body and pressed his face into the gap of Shen Qingqiu's collar. 师尊, it hurts, he said in a tiny voice. My head hurts. The tone sounded both like he was acting cute and like it really did hurt, very much so. Shen Qingqiu slowly reached out with both arms, wrapping them around Luo Binghe's shoulders. Then he gently patted Luo Binghe while soothing him, like one would a child. Good boy. It'll stop hurting soon. If I'm good, I'll stop hurting, and Shizun won't leave me alone ever again, said Luo Binghe. It'll stop hurting in a moment. I don't believe you, Luo Binghe said quietly. Suddenly, he exploded and yelled, I don't believe you, I don't! Seeing that he was having another episode, Shen Qingqiu grabbed his shoulders and abruptly lifted himself up, head raised. The angle wasn't right. Teeth clacked against teeth, making pain radiate through him. Luo Binghe's lips were sealed, but his eyes continued to stare forward blankly. He blinked once, then twice. Shen Qingqiu's eyes were also open. As their wide-eyed gazes remained fixed on each other, Shen Qingqiu internally thought this extremely unsettling. After a while of just staring at each other, eyes completely unclosed, he finally gave in and shut his eyes first. With a flutter of his lashes, he pressed forward and deepened the kiss. His teeth and mouth were still ringing and numb from the collision. In truth, this act couldn't be called kissing at all, but gnawing. However, Luo Binghe was clearly very pleased with said gnawing. He bit all over Shen Qingqiu's lips like they were pieces of candy, his breaths growing shorter and shorter. Suddenly, he pressed Shen Qingqiu down against the ground. He was in a daze, but he still insisted on staring at Shen Qingqiu's face while he pressed tiny scattered kisses to his cheek, little by little. Originally, Shen Qingqiu's nerves had been stretched taut, but with his subconscious actions on Luo Binghe's part, he relaxed a bit. Shen Qingqiu's back scraped over the rough rocks, his flesh burning and stinging. He began to struggle violently, but the more he struggled, the less stable Luo Binghe's mental state became. His eyes were crimson, his breaths disordered, his mind in chaos. All he could think about was holding on to Shen Qingqiu. Shen Qingqiu braced his hands against Luo Binghe's chest, but the iron grasp on his waist left him unable to move. His legs were pressed back against his chest, his backside raised high. Luo Binghe seemed to have finally found some small sense of security. He grasped Shen Qingqiu's hair, lifting and kissing it. In his stupor, Luo Binghe knew no restraint. He only understood his own exhilaration. Shen Qingqiu's eyes flooded with hot tears. It hurt. It hurt so much. He was trembling from the pain, but he didn't forget what he should do next. He sent forth his spiritual energy, drawing the surging demonic qi within Luo Binghe's body into himself. This technique was incredibly stupid, but it was also incredibly effective. As Luo Binghe was supplying Xi Mo's sword with demonic qi, by drawing a portion of it into himself, it no longer received enough power. So Michael Ridge's descent naturally couldn't continue. Luo Binghe was enthusiastic, clutching at Shen Qingqiu and refusing to let go. His cheek rubbed against Shen Qingqiu's head, the action both docile and meek. But his bottom half told an entirely different story and could have been called savage. Shen Qingqiu could barely breathe within his grip, and his right hand clawed at the rocky ground, leaving behind trails of blood. Each breath he struggled to draw stuttered and caught as he gasped down air. He couldn't hold on. He really couldn't hold on anymore. Just as his head swam, his vision growing dark and darker, a faint beam of light flashed by him. There was a crisp clang of something hitting the ground, right next to Shen Qingqiu's bare shoulder. Alarmed, Luo Binghe looked up, and for a brief moment he seemed disoriented. Then his pupils abruptly shrank into pinpoints. The blurry scene before him gradually focused and came together, becoming clearer and clearer. He slowly lowered his head, and all the color drained from his face on the spot. Shen Qingqiu lay below him, robes torn into countless pieces. His legs were trembling, unable to close, his eyes frightfully red, like he was on his last breath. Luo Binghe reached out, wanting to touch him but also not daring to. His hands remained frozen in midair as he muttered, "Shizun." Once he heard Luo Binghe finally calling him Shizun as normal, Shen Qingqiu seemed to come alive, and he gasped in breath. Unfortunately, due to how strained his breath was, it almost sounded like a sob. Luo Binghe was stunned. "Shizun, what? What did I do?" Shen Qingqiu wanted to clear his throat, to lighten the mood a little, and say something like, quote, "You didn't do much, just your Shizun." However, the result was that he didn't manage to clear his throat and rather coughed up a mouthful of blood. Both of them froze in shock at the sight. Shen Qingqiu's tears hadn't had the chance to come out before Luo Binghe's began falling first. They plopped onto Shen Qingqiu's cheek, sliding down the curve of it. In the past, Shen Qingqiu's greatest fear had been women crying, and now his greatest fear was Luo Binghe crying. He wiped at Luo Binghe's face, comforting him like he was soothing a child. "Don't worry." Luo Binghe's tears fell like the pearls cut from their string, rolling down along his shoulder. He helplessly held Shen Qingqiu with one arm while muttering, "Shizun, don't hate me. I didn't know. I never wanted to hurt you. Why didn't you push me away? Why didn't you kill me?" Shen Qingqiu stroked his back gently, again and again. This master knows. This master was willing. He soothed him, but within his heart was an endless bleakness. He was the one who'd been wrecked, all right. So how come the guy who'd wrecked him was crying harder than he was? Luo Binghe's eyelashes still hung heavy with tears, but he couldn't afford to worry about his shyness or how he wasn't done crying. He stared blankly at the horrible sight between them, his face growing increasingly pale. Even so, he carefully tidied Shen Qingqiu's inner robe, then draped his own outer robe on top of him. Shen Qingqiu didn't dare look down himself. He slowly closed his legs, the muscle of his face twitching as he did so. Still, he did his best to school his expression into something less pained. To divert Luo Binghe's gaze and attention, Shen Qingqiu reached out and picked up the jade Guānjiàn beside him, then gestured at Luo Binghe to lower his head. Luo Binghe stammered, thought I had long since lost it. I thought I'd never find it again. Shen Qingqiu helped to loop the red string around his neck. Hold on to it from now on. Don't lose it again. After Shi Cun rescued me that time, could it be that he kept it with him ever since? Luo Binghe mumbled. It had been in the system's storage system the entire time, so saying that he had couldn't be considered wrong, right? Once he thought this, Shen Qingqiu feebly nodded once. Luo Binghe's arm around him slowly tightened. As his tears continued to flow, he suddenly noticed that the marks on his arm were rapidly receding. His blazing hot forehead and cheeks were also cooling at an incredible speed. Stunned, he said, What are you doing? Shen Qingqiu hugged him firmly, forcefully locking Luo Binghe against the crook of his arm so he couldn't flare around. I'm not doing anything, he said lowly. Like I told you, it'll stop hurting soon, so be good and don't move. Luo Binghe's voice cracked. Shi Cun, are you going to do what you did last time and use your own body to draw away Xingmo's demonic qi? The last time he referred to was a time when Shen Qingqiu had self-detonated. It must have left an enormous impact on him. It's different this time, said Shen Qingqiu. Luo Binghe slowly clenched his fist. Different how? He asked, voice quivering. Shi Cun, how can you do this to me? To think you would actually do the same thing a second time for the sake of other people. Do you feel that? I can watch you do this sort of thing right before me again. I should have realized that none of you would ever choose me. Every single one of you would rather throw me away. Listen to me, Luo Binghe, Shen Qingqiu said severely. Sure enough, Luo Binghe held back his tears and obediently listened. In order to give birth to you, Su Xiyan fought to death. Luo Binghe, oh Luo Binghe, why did you never consider it? Given the kind of person the old palace master was, would he have given his disciple a gentle, harmless drug? It must have been a drug that was absolutely fatal to demons. If she really had given in and obediently taken it, even if he hadn't died, how could you have peacefully grown up and harmed into who you are today? Luo Binghe's shoulders trembled. Shen Qingqiu made sure to emphasize every word. If I were her, no matter how venomous that drug was, I would have drunk it down without hesitation, then escaped the water prison. Afterward, I would draw all its effects into my own body. No matter how agonizing the process, no matter if the price would be the complete destruction of my martial aspect, no matter if it meant a horrible death, I absolutely would not allow my child to suffer even an ounce of harm. This is my conclusion. You can think that it's only a theory, because there's no longer anyone who can tell you what Su Xiyan was thinking before she breathed her last. But if she really had seen you as her shame, she wouldn't have needed to do a thing. Those were the coldest days of the year, with ice and snow everywhere. If she'd thrown you into the Luo River, could you have survived? Or she could have kept her bright and boundless future as a head disciple of Huanhua Palace and continued to drink any fresh poison the old palace master gave her. Then she wouldn't have needed to flee the prison in disgrace or hide from the Huanhua Palace disciples who searched for her. Moreover, if after giving birth to you on that lone ship, she hadn't taken off her outer robe and swaddled you in it, if she hadn't used the last of her strength to place you in that basin and push you out and away, you would have never lasted long enough for someone to rescue you. You would have become a mere lone spirit, frozen to death upon the Luo River. You're alive right here and now. So how can you just listen to and believe what others say when they claim that your mother was cold and heartless, that she didn't truly want you? Having said all this in one go, Shen Qingqiu was now short of breath, and there was the sensation of demonic qi rampaging through his limbs and bones. He used his remaining strength to clutch Luo Binghe's wrist. I'm not drawing away Xingmo's evil energy for anyone else or anything else. I do it for you and only you, he said. I don't want to see a Luo Binghe who spends the rest of his life controlled by Xingmo, whose mind is lost to its corrosion with illusions haunting him for all eternity. This master's expectations are for you to be alive and clear-minded, strong and healthy. Then he said softly, so don't say that no one wants you, or that no one will choose you, ever again. As Luo Binghe knelt by Shen Qingqiu's side, his eyes couldn't bear the weight of his tears any longer, and they rolled down his face like he was a child who'd been wronged. He had only ever been a child, walking the world alone, tripping and stumbling countless times, wanting only those few things, yet never able to grasp them. If only Shen Qingqiu had realized this earlier, he thought, he'd have definitely. But like he'd said before, within this world, there had never been any such thing as, quote, if only I had known, unquote. Luo Binghe suddenly broke out into a tearful smile. He grabbed Shen Qingqiu's hand with his own and held it to his cheek, then with his other hand picked up Xingmo's sword from the ground. The blade, still circulating with purple light, let out a terrifying shriek. Next to Shen Qingqiu there came the sound of something tearing, inch by inch. Shizun, I know why you said all these things. Luo Binghe stared unswervingly at Shen Qingqiu, the corner of his mouth tugging up a little. However, if Shizun is no longer here, if the only person in this world who holds these expectations for me no longer exists, then me being alive and clear-minded, healthy and strong, what meaning would any of that have? Luo Binghe's fever seemed to have infected him too. Shen Qingqiu was feeling a little dizzy. In his daze, he almost couldn't hear what Luo Binghe was saying anymore, and he was unable to stop Luo Binghe as he destroyed the sword. Dimly, he had the thought that this was fine. Quote, dying together also included a together. It didn't seem that bad. But then came a voice that he could still hear clearly. Congratulations! By hitting target values in all categories, the honored customer has been upgraded to a beginner-level VIP account. Would you like to activate the high-level ability, quote, self-saving?